Okay, so far we have done web pages without any sort of authentication. In other words, everyone is able to go in and add, edit, update, delete information. Now, in practice, that would not be feasible for a website. You certainly don't want anyone being able to go in and change the contents of IMDb, for example, if we're talking about movie information. Or Canvas, have people be able to go in and grade your own assignments or something like that. So just about any kind of server-side scripting site is going to have some kind of user authentication to make sure that only authorized users are doing it. So what we're going to cover today is sort of the most basic form in the ASP.NET Core framework for authentication. And I don't know, we might go in more detail with a more detailed example or more complex example, but we'll start with the simplest form and say that's good for now. And that is known as identity. All right, making sure that you identify the people and then putting restrictions on the content that they can get to without without logging on, and making sure that some of the resources are controlled and the user would have to be logged on for that. So I'm going to go and I'm going to create a new website. Project. And as we've been doing, I'm going to create it as a ASP.NET Core web application. We're going to call this news. This will be similar to the example I have posted out on Canvas. I just wanted to go through the process of actually creating it in front of you and talking you through it. All right. Next, all right, we're going to take .NET Framework 6.0. Under authentication, we're going to put individual accounts as opposed to some of these other options. We're going to take individual accounts, which means that within the application, there'll actually be accounts created for each user. And excuse me. I hit create and I do my thing. And we have the start of a website like we would have had before. All right, I'm going to go through and I'm going to add a folder for models. And in that, I'm going to add my model. Which is simply in a class. I'm going to call my class news story. And in the interest of time, I have the model already created. I'm going to just copy and paste it in. All right. Now you might wonder, how does it know what to make a primary key? For example, when we run this through, it's going to create a primary key for ID. Well, that's one of the assumptions it makes. If it's named ID or if it's named table name ID, it's going to make it a primary key. So it takes a guess, essentially, but it does a pretty good job guessing. If you notice, we've not had to go back and explicitly define a key at all. In all the cases, the model model was smart enough to know what was the primary key. And I'm not going to put very many data annotations in here. We're going to keep that simple. You, of course, would be best to add things to like this. So I have my model for news story. I'm then going to, under pages, I'm going to create a folder. And again, a student had this problem in class. Let me just refresh your memory. If you're creating a folder, it should be different than the name that you created the model for the class. Usually what I do is I'll make the model singular and I'll make the folder for the scaffolded pages plural. So if it's news story, the model class, I will make the folder news stories. Right? And if you don't, you get an error. So if you think you've done everything right and you've gotten an error when you try to run it, first thing to check, or one of the first things to check, is to make sure that your model and your folder for the pages are not exactly the same. All right, so I'm going to go and scaffold this. So I'm going to add new scaffolded item. Create Razor pages using CRUD. Click add. Now, my model class, I'm going to pick its news story. Now, here's where it gets a little tricky, all right? Because we've already created a database for this application. We've created a database for the identity, or in other words, the login credentials. So if we look at this dropdown for data context class, it will show application DB context. And we could use that to put the rest of our database tables in, or we could make a separate context. There could be benefits doing it either way. I'm going to make a separate context for this. That is going to sort of complicate things a little bit whenever we go to create a scaffold, whenever we go to create a migration, or whenever we go to update the database. We have two contexts. That is, we have two databases. So we're going to need to specify which one we want to update. So I'm going to click the plus like I did before, and we get news, data, news context. I'm going to click add. And I'm going to click add. And it's going to do its thing. And it's going to create pages along with a new data context. All right, so it added those pages. How do I know I have two contexts? We see it added those pages. If I look in the data folder, I now have two contexts, application DB context and news context. I have to create a migration and update both of them. So I'm going to go up here and I'm going to say add dash migration. Okay, if it's dash context or just context. It's just context. I'm going to put an application DB context, and I'm going to put the name of the migration. Initial for identity. And that gives me an error. I did need a dash. No database application. Oh, I made a typo on it. Yeah, at the end. Finally, it went and it did its thing. All right. I now need to update that database. So I will say update dash database. And I will do dash context and put in the name of it again, which is application DB context. Again, our user IDs and all this are going to be stored in a separate database. There's reasons to do that, just as there's reasons to put them in the same database. So I hit that, it goes, does its thing. And it's creating all the tables that it needs for the logging in and the identity part. I need to now do the same thing for my second database, where I put my applications table, such as the news stories table. So I'm going to go and say, on migration, context, and I'm going to give it a different migration name. And I am going to update the database. I now have to, and again, make sure you do this step, I need to put the news in the navigation. Where's the navigation? It is in pages, shared, underscore layout. So I'm going to edit this guy, and I'm going to put a link here to news stories. And the page for that is news stories /index. And the text for that will be news stories. Now that we've done this, if we run it, it's going to behave just like any of the other applications we've written before, except there's going to be the ability to register a user and to create a username and to log on as that user. Well, we're going to skip that functionality for now because none of our pages require that. We have to tell the pages that they require a login or not. So to verify that this works, I'm going to go in here. And I'm going to make sure I can add a news story. Probably be a bigger field. We can do that. Take a look at that a bit here. Create it, and there we go. Now again, the way it's written, anyone can create one, a news story. Anyone can edit it. Anyone can delete it. Could you imagine having a website where anyone could add a news story? That would not be a very good idea, and one of the biggest understatements in history. So what we need to do is we need to control it so only people that are logged on will be able to get into create, edit, and delete. We'll allow people that are not logged on to see the list of stories as well as the details, but we will not allow them to create, edit, or delete. Well, how do we do that? We do that this way, by putting another directive in the pages that we want to restrict. So, create, we want to restrict. So I'm going to go into the CS file and I'm going to put right before the class is created the word authorize. Right here I put authorize. Now, it's giving me an error because we have to use this. Now it gets away from the error. Now, we're all set, and you have to be logged on to add a new story, to get into this create. Now, we'll do that to add. We'll also do that to delete. And we have to put that in. Okay, why doesn't it like that? And so we did it in delete. We'll also do it in edit. None of these pages create the delete and the edit will we be able to get to if we are not logged on. So let's see what happens if we do. We can go and run it. Let's see what happens if we try to. I go to that. It shows me this. This is okay to see, right? Because a user should be able to see this, all right? But if they go to create a new one, it's going to demand that they're logged on. And if they're not logged on, they can't get to that page. Now, there's a register here, all right? I'm going to click register as a new user. Keep in mind, what we're doing here is the most basic form of validation that says, hey, you have to be logged on to do this. So I'm going to put my email in. Why is that not a valid email address? Password has to be required. I am going to Why does it not like, oh, I have a comma there, not a period. Okay, so now I can register. Password has to have at least one uppercase letter. Great, so. All right, now, normally, if we were on an actual web server, a production web server, the web server would have an email server. And we would configure it such that after the user registered, we would send an email to their email address asking them to confirm. I'm sure anyone who's registered for a site has probably seen examples of that. However, since there is no email sender registered for this application, and they give us docs to do this, we're going to click this pretend link, all right, that would act as though we're verifying the email address. This would be the link that you would get to confirm the email address. Again, you would not see this in production. This is only in development mode that you would see this. And so we can test this out in development mode. This would be something you'd have to test better when you actually connected this to a real web server that had an email server associated with it. So I'm going to click this to confirm my account, and back in business. How can I add it? Well, I have to log on. I'm going to click Remember Me. And I hope I remember the password. And I'm going to click Remember Me. And I'm logged on, and look, now it knows who I am. It displays my name up there. And I can go in and create a new story. And I'm in business. Now, every time I go and try to do that, since I'm already logged on, it's not going to complain. Edit. It knows that I'm logged on, therefore it doesn't give me any gripes for that, and I'm okay. Now I can click to log out if I wanted to, and log out. That would successfully log me out of the application, and then the same thing would apply. Now, if I click that Remember Me and I'm logged in, when I shut down, when I go to run it again, it stores my login credentials in a cookie. So it automatically logs me on as soon as I go there. So you don't have to manually go back in and re-log in. You're all set to go. And you could delete a news story if you wanted to, and so on. That's the basics of identity. For our first lab and for until we cover more, that's all you need to do as far as identity goes. You should at least have this basic identity in your project, because it doesn't make sense to allow just anyone to add information. Now, it could be that, for example, at a news site like this, It could be that someone that we don't have the register, that we don't allow the register option on it. Because if I went to a new site, I should not be able just to register for the site and enter it in, but we don't have to take that step. If we get into more about identity and authorization, we'll cover some more scenarios where we have different roles assigned to the people and so on. Now, one thing that I complained about is a small space for the summary. Let's take care of that. I'm going to do it first to the edit, but I should also probably do it to the add. I'm going to go into the HTML. And I'm going to replace this text area, or I'm going to replace rather this input with a text area. So again, remembering your HTML and how HTML works with forms is important here. A text area is a multiple line input. So we can go in here now, and it should work that when we go into edit mode for this, we have a bigger field. Only we do have a little problem here. It actually assumes that the rest of it is data. So I've noticed this before in plain old HTML. We can't do the null tag with the text area. We have to do explicitly the start and end tag. So now let's go and run it. And it has the text, and we can type more in. We can actually make the text area bigger if we want to. Nice little feature. Looks like we could only expand it vertically and not horizontally, although we could through CSS make it bigger or wider as well as taller. And we can go on and enter more data. Now we're going to have to put that also in the create mode. Close some of these things. Oops. And now we get it when we create a new story as well. Again, because we said to remember me, it stored the data in a cookie, and every time we log in, it automatically every time we connect, rather, it automatically logs it in. We have, again, a text area to enter in instead of a plain old input. Any questions about this so far? You could definitely get more involved than this. This is just the very basics of creating identity, and that's good enough for now. I want to introduce it to you. And again, depending on how the rest of the course goes, we may look at additional ways of validating and adding user groups and all that. But one thing I would like to do that I don't think we've done so far is look at the generated pages, at the scaffolded pages, and see how they look. I think we looked at some of them, but not all of them. So let's go through and let's look at create, delete, edit. We have looked at index. That's with the listing. Won't hurt to look at it again. Code behind is going to form a list of news stories. And it's public so that it can be accessed by the Razor page. When this page is initially loaded, it pulls a list. It pulls the list from the database, from the context of all the news stories and creates a list of them. That list then is looped through and we display the different items for each variable. Let's look at create. With create, we have labels and inputs for different things in the news story object. This is the news story object. We bound the property so it's accessible on the page as well as on the model. So when we say this, field is for news story title, it's referring to this object, which is a news story object, is referring to its title attribute. All we are doing here is the page allows us to enter values for all the attributes in that news story object. And when we click save on post, so when we post to this page, that is when we click save, it takes that object and adds it to the collection that is in the database. And it redirects us back to the index page. So the create is pretty straightforward as well. Let's look at the delete, or let's look at the details next. One's also going to be a little easier. Now with the details, if you notice when we run this, we click create new, we get create on the URL, but there's nothing on the query string. If we click edit, details or delete, if we look closely at the very bottom of the page, it's passing on the query string the ID of the of the news story that we want. If you think about it, that makes sense. The listing page, we want to show all of them. We're not interested in a specific one. So we don't have to identify which one we want to see on this page because we want to see all of them. On create, we're not dealing with a news story that has already been created. We're creating a brand new one. So we don't have an ID for the new one yet. But when we go to edit, details, or delete, we also have to pass to the new page the ID number of the page that, or of the news story that we want to edit or delete or display. If you notice in the, or it creates that link, it actually adds an ID to that link. So we're calling edit, but we're passing it the ID of this item. Likewise with details and delete. So what we're doing here is we take that ID that we're passed. If for some reason there's no ID there, or if there are no stories in the database, it returns that there was nothing found. Otherwise, again, we're using link to say, give me the news story. We want the first or the default value from the news story where the ID in the news story matches the ID that was in the query string. This is the ID that was in the query string, and it will get passed in if there is an ID on the query string. First time, or if there is no ID, then ID is null, and we return not found. If the news story is null, it returns not found. Otherwise, this is the news story we're interested in. We put it in the object called news story, which again is public, and the details Razor page can then pull from their news story title, release date, and summary. So far, so good. A lot of that's going to be the same, but the edit and delete are a little more involved. We look at the edit, for example. We have the same sort of thing. When the page loads on a get, it pulls the query string from, it pulls the ID rather from the query string. It looks for it. It tries to retrieve it. It does essentially the same thing as when we're viewing details. And if we looked at the delete, I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't do the exact same thing. The difference comes in when we go and when we post it. So when we have an answer. First thing we do is we validate. All right. Remember all those annotations that we put in to put validation rules for individual things. We do all those validations, and if it's valid, if it's not valid rather, we simply stay on that page. Here we're remembering that that news story is modified. And we try to save the changes to the database. If there's an error, it throws an extension or an exception rather. It throws an exception. In this case, it returns not found if we're trying to update something that doesn't exist. So if we can't do this, if we can't make our save, it looks to see why we can't make our save. If we can't make the save because that news story no longer exists. That would occur if me and you went to edit that at the same time, and you went in to edit it and I went in to delete it. And I clicked delete before you clicked save to save your changes. It would get deleted and it would no longer exist. Therefore, you could not perform an update. So this update would fail. And why would it fail? Well, one of the reasons it would fail is because there's no news story with that ID anymore. That's what we check here in news story exists. We display, we look to see if that exists, and if it doesn't exist, then it's not found. Otherwise, it's an exception. If you try to update something and you're not able to, then that's the problem, and we're not really sure exactly what the cause of it is. I would guess delete has similar code in here. We do the same thing when we retrieve it on the OnGap. When we click to save, if the ID is null or the news story object is null, it's not found. Otherwise, we pull up that news story. If it's not null, we delete it and save changes. So take a minute to go through this code and understand what's going on, because at some point you're going to need to change what was scaffolded. It's great that Visual Studio scaffolds code for you and gives you sort of a head start of writing your pages to insert, update, and delete. But it doesn't do everything for you. And therefore, it's important to understand exactly what it's doing so you can go and make whatever modifications it needs to customize that page. Okay, next week is spring break, which means we do not have a class. We do not have an in-person class. There will not be a video lecture. I will be around during spring break, so you can email me business as usual. All right, so you can send me questions, and I might not get to them quite as fast as I do during regular school time, but I will promise to get to them because I will be doing work despite the fact that it's break. You most likely, you will most likely be getting emails from me. That's fine. I encourage that. In fact, I welcome that. It's great students that are interested in learning the material, and if they don't understand something, ask. That I will never complain about. So by all means, email away. All right. We'll either see you in lab or we'll see you the week after next. So have a good break. We'll talk to you later. Take care.
Kind of funny that there's a specific